This is the last signal radio, transmitting what we're witnessing as the world begins to change. Mirrors began misbehaving first, though no one knew it at the time. A glance in the bathroom, and for a fraction of a second, a smile lingered on the reflection's lips long after the person had stopped smiling. A shadow moved where it shouldn't. A puddle in an empty alley rippled, and on its surface, a face that was not there stared back. It started subtly. In London, a woman saw her reflection wave goodbye, though her hand had stayed at her side. In New York, a man noticed his mirrored self blink before he did, a heartbeat ahead, and then froze with a grin that never touched his own face. At first, everyone dismissed it. Fatigue, stress, the mind playing tricks. But the reports piled in too fast, too consistent. Windows became unreliable. People saw movements where none existed. Doors opened silently. Footsteps echoed in empty hallways. CCTV cameras captured figures in places no one had been. Social media posts went viral. Puddles with faces, reflections performing acts not yet committed in reality. The anomalies were growing bolder, spreading. In Sao Paulo, someone reported seeing their reflection sitting in the street, staring at them from a puddle, unmoving, waiting. In Cairo, a man noticed the shop mirror mimic his movements with a deliberate delay, but sometimes it acted before he did. The patterns were inconsistent, but precise, almost intelligent. Fear began to take root. People avoided mirrors, shuttered windows, puddles. Shops taped over reflective surfaces. Homes became barren of glass. Rumors spread faster than evidence. People whispered about reflections moving independently, stepping out of their surfaces, interacting with the world. They called it the mirror plague, though it was no disease. No one understood what it was. And yet, it was real. Reports poured in from Tokyo, Moscow, Paris, Cairo, New York, London. Too many to ignore. Stories matched. In each city, reflections began to misalign with reality. Faces lingered, shadows moved separately from their bodies, and puddles rippled with images of impossible events. Some tried to test it. A man in Berlin waved at his mirror, then stayed perfectly still. The reflection smiled, then stepped aside. A small movement, almost casual, but unmistakable. In a kitchen in Rome, a reflection lifted a cup before the human did. Someone in Sydney reported their mirrored self leaving the bathroom entirely, though the door never opened. Panic began to creep in. Families argued over what they saw. Friends doubted each other. Communities grew suspicious. Some people refused to look at any reflective surface. Others became obsessed, staring, recording, trying to understand the impossible. Rumors of objects moving on their own circulated. Reports of doors opening, chairs sliding, cups tipping without cause began arriving from every continent. It was relentless. No place felt safe. No surface could be trusted. People began leaving their homes in droves, seeking spaces without glass, mirrors, or puddles. Parks, warehouses, even underground tunnels became shelters, and yet the anomaly followed. Reports came of puddles forming where there should be none, glass fragments reflecting movements that weren't happening. By nightfall, disbelief had given way to terror. Street cameras captured images that contradicted human memory. Faces in puddles blinked, smiled, frowned before anyone present had done so. Shadowed figures appeared where no one had walked. Phones and cameras, left untouched, seemed to capture movements of their own. though no one could explain how. People began whispering to one another. Did the reflections know them? Were they watching? Were they waiting? The questions were everywhere, the answers nowhere. Panic and confusion twisted through cities like wildfire. Authorities issued warnings, but no one knew what to advise. Stay inside, avoid mirrors, cover all windows. Every instruction seemed insufficient. And still, the anomalies continued. In Paris, someone recorded their reflection laughing before they themselves had done so. In Cairo, a child saw a mirrored version of herself walking into the street. And then she followed, but no one else was there. In Sao Paulo, someone's reflection appeared behind them, standing in a hallway that didn't exist. It was small at first, almost invisible, but growing everywhere, persistent, relentless. The world had changed without realizing it, the familiar becoming unpredictable, untrustworthy. Ordinary life shattered silently, piece by piece, and every reflection, every ripple, every mirrored smile hinted at a presence beyond comprehension. People whispered about it in the dark. Huddled together, they described faces that shouldn't exist, movements that defied possibility. They wondered aloud if the world was still theirs. The fear spread faster than the phenomena themselves. Anxiety became contagious. Families broke apart. Strangers eyed each other suspiciously, wondering if someone had been replaced, if someone wasn't quite human anymore. The first signs were subtle, almost ignorable. Now, there was no ignoring them. Every reflective surface held a question, every puddle a warning. Humanity was learning that the world it knew could no longer be trusted. Reality itself had begun to fracture, and the reflections, they were waiting. Whispers began almost imperceptibly. People thought it was the wind, the hum of electricity, their own minds playing tricks. Then they realized it wasn't coming from outside. It came from the surfaces themselves. Mirrors, windows, puddles, every reflective plane began murmuring, just enough to be heard, just enough to seed fear. In Paris, a woman froze in her apartment when her bathroom mirror breathed her name. She wasn't alone, she knew it, but no one was there. In Cairo, a man reported that his reflection tilted its head, observing him with a curiosity that felt almost human. Then it moved a cup, ever so slightly, as if testing him. The subtle manipulations spread. Objects shifted. Chairs nudged across floors. Doors creaked open without a hand to push them. Shadows twisted independently of the people casting them. In Sao Paulo, a child's shadow began walking beside her rather than following, mirroring movements that hadn't been made yet. Panic grew quietly at first, then erupted. Cities became haunted houses of doubt. Families argued over what they had seen. Friends doubted one another. In London, a man refused to enter his living room after seeing his reflection raise a hand he hadn't moved. He slept in the hallway, leaving the mirrors covered, windows shuttered. News feeds flooded with accounts from across the globe. Reports matched too closely to dismiss. Reflections predicting actions. Whispers warning of events yet to occur. Shadows that defied physics. People began to question their own memories, their own senses. Was the reflection the one anticipating the future? Or were humans losing control over their own actions? Fear settled into homes like a cold fog. People stopped looking into mirrors, avoided windows, and ignored puddles. Some clutched their phones, documenting everything they could, though even the devices seemed unreliable. Others barricaded themselves, hiding from reflections that had begun to hint at awareness, at intention. Whispers weren't always benign. In New York, a teenager reported hearing a voice from her mirror warning her not to leave her room. Minutes later, she saw a figure step into the hallway that no one else had entered. The reflection had acted, preempting her movement. In Moscow, a reflection gestured violently before the person it mirrored acted. Objects tipped, walls shook, chaos ensued. The phenomena became deliberate. Reflections mimicked violent acts before the real ones occurred. Subtle at first, a smashed cup, a tripped pedestrian, but escalating. Fear transformed into hysteria. Parents clutched children, friends avoided friends. Neighborhoods emptied as people fled into places without glass. By evening, whispers had become urgent warnings. Some claimed the reflections were trying to communicate, to influence, to prepare humanity. Others swore they were taunting, mocking, controlling. The line between reality and reflection blurred. People began seeing actions in puddles and mirrors before they themselves acted. Fear became prophecy. In Tokyo, a reflection lifted a pen before the hand it mirrored moved. In Rome, a shadow knocked over a lamp seconds before a person reached for it. Messages circulated online. If you saw something in a reflection, it might be real, or it might already be happening. No one could tell. The anxiety fed itself, feeding the whispers, the shadows, the impossible movement. Halls, streets, homes, offices, all became arenas of doubt. People started panicking when nothing happened, just because a reflection hinted it might. Grocery stores emptied as residents refused to leave for fear their reflections had already moved ahead. Cities locked down themselves, voluntarily, not by law, but by terror. And yet, amidst the chaos, some still watched. They recorded, documented, and tried to track patterns. But the patterns were intelligent, chaotic, yet deliberate. The world had learned that reflections could observe, anticipate, even manipulate. The concept of a safe space vanished. No surface, no shadow, no image could be trusted. Humanity had never been so aware of its own vulnerability, and the world was only beginning to understand. Shadows didn't just follow. Reflections didn't just imitate. They waited, they tested, they communicated in ways humans couldn't comprehend. By nightfall, fear became nearly tangible. Streets were empty, homes were silent, cities were paused in collective anxiety. Reflections moved freely, whispers filled empty rooms, and shadows stretched unnaturally. People huddled in corners, questioning if their own bodies could be trusted. If the reflection they saw might act first, think first, exist first. Across continents, the same stories emerged. Puddles in alleys reflected acts that would happen minutes later. Mirrors in homes anticipated human actions, sometimes gently, sometimes violently. Shadows walked independently, testing the reactions of those they followed. The world had become a place where the familiar no longer applied, where mirrors held secrets, and every reflection was a potential threat. No one slept easily. Every glance at a window, a puddle, or a polished surface carried suspicion. The whispers continued. Shadows moved. And the reflection of humanity began behaving as though it had its own life, separate from the world it had mirrored for centuries. the first signs were subtle. The whispers, the shadows, the anticipatory movements. They had seemed almost insignificant. But now, the truth was unavoidable. The world had been seen, and now it was being responded to. Fear was not just a reaction. It was becoming contagious, a tangible force, feeding itself through every reflection, every shadow, every whispered warning. Humanity was no longer alone with its reflections. It began quietly, almost imperceptibly, in the early hours. A reflection lingered too long in a mirror, hesitated at the edge of its surface, then stepped out. Not all at once, one foot, then another, until it was fully in the room. The first reports were met with disbelief. How could it leave? Reflections were never real, never tangible. And yet they moved. They breathed. They existed. In Paris, a man's reflection climbed down from the bathroom mirror, touching the floor with its own hands, independent of his own. It lingered, observing him, and then returned to the glass, as though considering whether the world was ready to notice. In London, a shopkeeper's mirrored self stepped into the aisle, knocking over a stack of boxes, moving with intent that the man could not control or explain. Panic spread faster than the reflections themselves. Witnesses described scenes that defied reason. A reflection in Sao Paulo sat in a chair and picked up objects without permission. In Cairo, a mirrored child left the hallway and wandered into the street, paused, then returned. The actions were deliberate, yet unnervingly casual, as if testing boundaries, learning. Cities became theaters of uncertainty. Windows reflected streets that no longer matched reality. Doors opened to reveal hallways where no one had walked. Puddles became gateways, small portals through which the mirrored world began to reach into ours. People ran in terror from reflections they had once ignored. Some hid, some screamed, some froze in disbelief. And in the spaces between, the reflections observed, waited, and sometimes mimicked actions before humans dared act. The news feeds were filled with impossibilities. CCTV cameras captured figures stepping out of mirrors, walking down streets, interacting with objects. Yet, when authorities rushed to the scenes, there was nothing. No one to apprehend, no bodies, only the lingering traces of movement. Footprints appeared and vanished, shadows crossed spaces that should have been empty, and reflections returned to their surfaces as if nothing had happened. Fear reached every corner of the globe. Families barricaded themselves, terrified to leave a single reflective surface exposed. Children refused to sleep in rooms with mirrors. Governments issued vague warnings, unable to provide guidance. Streets emptied as the rational world retreated indoors, and the city itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the reflections to act again. And the reflections did. In Tokyo, a mirrored figure stepped onto a balcony, leaning over the railing before climbing down as if learning how the world worked. In New York, a reflection entered a subway station, moving fluidly among the commuters, mimicking and observing in equal measure. People noticed inconsistencies. Someone's reflection smiling when they hadn't, nodding when they shook their heads, leaving behind items that hadn't existed moments before. Even small objects were affected. Mirrors and puddles became tools. Reflections pushed furniture, lifted doors, opened cupboards. Ordinary life unraveled quietly. Houses were left in disarray, groceries untouched, chairs overturned, cups tipped onto the floor. The world began to feel uncertain, like a stage in which humans were merely actors being watched by invisible directors. And everywhere, the whispers continued, soft at first, almost apologetic, then insistent. Don't move. Watch them. They know. People clutched each other, trembling, unsure if the warnings were meant to help or to torment. Streets, once lively, became silent, except for the occasional sound of a reflection stepping across a floor, leaving no one to confirm its existence. In Sao Paulo, a woman froze as her mirrored self walked past her, turning to look directly at her. Her heartbeat raced, her breath caught. The reflection mimicked her movements, then performed actions she hadn't yet done, tilting her head, lifting her hand, walking to the door. Panic overtook her. She ran outside, thinking she could escape. But on the street, reflections mirrored entire crowds, creating confusion and terror. People fled from images of themselves, from figures that should not have existed. And everywhere the pattern repeated. In Cairo, London, Paris, Tokyo, New York, mirrored duplicates left surfaces and explored the world, moving freely but deliberately, as if testing human reactions. People began to doubt themselves, unsure if their own actions were their own, unsure if reality could be trusted. The first injuries were reported. A reflection knocked over a railing in Rome, causing a man to fall. In Moscow, a mirrored figure pushed a child away from a puddle, or perhaps toward it. No one could tell. Panic turned to hysteria as humans realized they were no longer in control, no longer the only conscious participants in their own world. And yet, amidst the chaos, a horrifying thought emerged. The reflections were not random. They moved with purpose, observing, interacting, testing. Not all were violent, but all were deliberate. And the more people panicked, the bolder the reflections became. By nightfall, the world had transformed. Cities were empty, streets deserted, homes barricaded. Mirrors reflected untrustworthy images. Puddles contained impossible faces. Shadows moved independently. Humanity huddled, silent, terrified, and watched as the mirrored world began to explore the spaces once thought safe. Ordinary life had ended quietly, almost without notice. Reflection by reflection, surface by surface, the world was changing. Humans had become secondary observers in a reality that no longer belonged entirely to them. And the reflections, they were learning. It started with small incidents, an overturned cup, a tripped pedestrian, a shadow knocking over a chair. People dismissed them at first, accidents, coincidences. But then came the deliberate actions, the preemptive movements, the moments when reflections acted before reality had even caught up. In Paris, a man saw his reflection lift a knife before he had even touched it. He froze, staring at the mirrored figure, heart hammering, and then the blade fell from the reflection's hand, clattering on the floor. The sound echoed through his empty apartment like a warning. He hadn't moved. He hadn't done anything. But the reflection had acted. London reports followed swiftly. A reflection shoved a child toward the street, just as the real child was about to step out. A car horn blared, brakes screeched, but the child was unharmed. For now. Witnesses shook, uncertain whether to run or stay, uncertain if their reflections could predict them, or manipulate them, or worse, replace them. Whispers began accompanying the movements, soft, insistent, often unintelligible. Watch, stop, turn. People could feel the eyes in every reflective surface. Mirrors, puddles, polished floors. They were watching, guiding, warning, or threatening. No one could be certain which. Anxiety became instinct. Every glance at a window, a mirror, a puddle was accompanied by a shiver. In Sao Paulo, a reflection reached for a doorknob seconds before the person it mirrored did. It hesitated, testing the reaction, then withdrew. In Cairo, a reflection moved furniture just as the human intended to sit. The message was clear. The mirrored world had learned anticipation. It was adapting. It was thinking. Reports of injuries multiplied. In Tokyo, a reflection tripped a man down a flight of stairs, mimicking the movement of an unseen force. In Rome, a mirrored figure shoved a cyclist just before the rider lost control. The coincidences could no longer be explained. People whispered of mirrored violence, acts committed by images that should not have existed. Fear took root in the streets, in homes, in every human heart. Parents refused to let children out of their sight, fearing the reflections might predict them, mimic them, or harm them before they could react. Office buildings emptied as workers refused to approach mirrors or glass doors. Shops shuttered their windows, but reflections adapted. Small puddles, polished floors, even spoons on tables became portals for observation, for manipulation. In New York, a man documented his reflection opening a door seconds before he did. He tried to warn neighbors, but others began to doubt him. How could something not real act first? How could it be anticipated? How could it exist independently? Fear made people question their own memories, their own perceptions. The boundaries between reality and reflection were dissolving. Some reflections acted subtly, others violently. In Moscow, a reflection shoved a stranger into traffic, anticipating the movement that would have saved them. The chaos was growing exponentially, and people realized they were no longer in control of their environment, or even their own bodies. Rumors spread. Stories of deaths caused by mirrored actions circulated, but verification was impossible. Families, neighbors, entire blocks reported missing people, sudden injuries, accidents no one could explain. Humanity's collective anxiety surged. Every reflective surface became a threat, every shadow a potential danger. People adapted in strange ways. Streets were avoided at night, mirrors covered or shattered, puddles avoided. Some barricaded themselves indoors for days. Others wandered in a stupor, obsessed with watching their own reflections, trying to anticipate the next movement, the next warning. Society was unraveling under the weight of anticipation. News agencies, where they still functioned, broadcast warnings. Do not trust reflections. Avoid glass surfaces. Do not approach puddles. Governments issued vague statements. Remain indoors. Do not panic. But the advice was inadequate. Humanity was witnessing a reality that no longer obeyed logic, reason, or expectation. Every reflection seemed to carry intention. Every mirrored surface suggested action. People noticed that their reflections sometimes acted violently, not just ahead of them, but before events occurred in the real world. It was as if the mirrored world had its own timeline, intersecting with ours, anticipating, correcting, manipulating. Panic became contagious. Neighbors turned on neighbors. Families argued over who could be trusted. Entire streets emptied as the unexplainable spread faster than the explanations. Humanity's instinct to survive collided with its inability to comprehend what it was surviving from. And yet, amidst the fear, people could not stop looking. Some documented every reflection, every shadow, every movement. They posted images, shared videos, compared anomalies across continents. The world tried to make sense of the senseless. Patterns began to emerge, but even those were terrifying. Reflections were deliberate, intelligent, calculated. By nightfall, cities were hollowed shells. Windows reflected unrecognizable streets. Mirrors betrayed their owners. Puddles rippled with movements yet to come. Shadows moved independently. And every human knew in the pit of their stomachs that the reflections were not merely passive. They were aware, observant, predicting, waiting. The warnings were no longer whispered. They lived. The reflections had taught humanity its first lesson. Nothing, not even the self, could be trusted. And the world had only just begun to listen. People needed answers. The fear, the confusion, the inexplicable movements of reflections, it could not continue without explanation. Scientists scrambled, governments convened emergency meetings, and researchers pored over every report, every recording, every image. Nothing was sufficient. Nothing was conclusive. Early theories circulated quickly. Some suggested a strange electromagnetic anomaly, a global distortion of perception. Others whispered of parallel dimensions, fragments of a mirrored universe bleeding into ours. Psychologists proposed mass hysteria, collective delusion, the mind's desperate attempt to rationalize the impossible. None of these explanations satisfied the evidence. None accounted for the deliberate, intelligent actions of reflections. In universities, labs, and private research facilities, images of reflections leaving mirrors, manipulating objects, predicting human movement, were studied with frantic intensity. Every scientist knew the world was facing something unprecedented. Even the most skeptical acknowledged that reality itself seemed compromised. Reports accumulated, mirrors smiling before the human, puddles rippling with future events, shadows moving independently. Small objects were being displaced. Entire streets emptied as people fled from reflections. Patterns emerged, subtle and terrifying. Reflections were not random. They were testing, learning, anticipating. The theories became more speculative. Quantum anomalies were suggested, consciousness leakage across dimensions, time ripples allowing mirrors to act ahead of reality. Some scientists posited that reflections were observing, recording, and interacting through surfaces with a logic humans could not yet perceive. The more evidence accumulated, the more improbable explanations became necessary. People turned to social media, forums, video platforms, whatever remained functioning, to share observations. Images were compared. Patterns were mapped. Cities across the world noted similarities. A reflection in Sao Paulo predicting actions also occurred in Tokyo, Paris, New York. The scale was global. The intelligence seemed coordinated. Fear did not lessen. If anything, the more the world searched for understanding, the deeper the panic grew. Governments tried to issue guidance, avoid mirrors, cover windows, stay indoors. Yet people were terrified even of the advice itself. Could the reflections anticipate the warnings? Were humans acting already in reflections' design? Anxiety fed on uncertainty, a contagion more potent than any virus. Some turned to religion, seeking divine explanation. Others retreated into isolation, abandoning technology, mirrors, even polished surfaces. Communities attempted rituals, ceremonies, and collective prayers. Nothing worked. The reflections persisted, learning, anticipating, moving with intelligence. In cities, urban legends began to take shape. People whispered about reflections leaving clues, testing human reactions, teaching lessons. Stories of objects moving, subtle manipulations, and preemptive actions spread like wildfire. Humanity's understanding of reality was unraveling in real time. Yet among the chaos, scientists began to notice patterns. Movements were deliberate, coordinated, and often predictive. There were repetitions, subtle differences, variations that suggested intention. Could the reflections be sentient? Could they be learning? Could the mirrored world be alive in some form humanity had never imagined? Authorities grew desperate. Military personnel were deployed to investigate reflection anomalies. Units reported objects moved without explanation, shadows interacting with soldiers, mirrors displaying actions before they occurred. Standard physics failed. Conventional strategy failed. Humanity faced a force it could not measure, predict, or contain. Journalists documented the fear, the hysteria, the inexplicable events. Families abandoned homes. Streets became silent, except for the occasional shuffle of a reflection stepping outside its surface, exploring, observing. Communities tried to self-organize, creating watch groups, patrols, barricades, but the mirrored world was unpredictable. It anticipated movement, adapted to human behavior, and responded before anyone knew to act. The collective consciousness of the world shifted. Humans no longer trusted themselves. They no longer trusted what they saw. Mirrors, puddles, polished surfaces, once mundane, were now gateways of doubt. Every action was potentially mirrored, every movement potentially observed, every decision potentially anticipated. And yet scientists continued to theorize. Mathematical models were created, trying to predict reflection behavior. Algorithms were fed with data, attempting to find causality. Patterns emerged that defied explanation, forming a terrifying suggestion. The mirrored world was not merely reactive, it was interactive. It was experimenting, adjusting, and learning from humans. No one could explain its origin. No one could control it. But the evidence was undeniable. Humanity was facing a reality in which mirrors and reflections were active participants. Some suggested containment, but containment seemed impossible. Others suggested observation, study, and documentation, though those who dared observe often suffered panic, injury, or worse. By the end of the day, the world had grown silent under tension. Cities emptied, streets hollow, and homes fortified against their own mirrors. Theories proliferated, but fear grew faster than understanding. Humanity had glimpsed the depth of the anomaly, and with that glimpse came the realization. The world itself might no longer belong solely to them. Reports of injuries, preemptive movements, and manipulations continued. People spoke of reflections that knew what they would do before they themselves knew. Humans began questioning not just reality, but their own perception, their own existence within it. The mirrored world had revealed a frightening truth. Ordinary life, safety, predictability, they were no longer guaranteed. And still, no one knew the full scale. No one knew how far the reflections could reach, how intelligent they were, or whether they had a goal. Humanity faced a world simultaneously familiar and alien, mundane and impossible, observed and manipulated. Every mirror, every puddle, every reflective surface was a potential participant in a silent, relentless experiment. The first signs had grown into whispers. The whispers had become shadows. Now, theories were all that remained, fragile attempts to understand a reality slipping away from human control. The world had begun its descent into uncertainty. And the reflections, they were watching. By the time morning broke over cities worldwide, it was clear that humanity no longer held dominion over its own reality. Fear had taken on a life of its own, spreading faster than the anomalies themselves. People fled their homes, barricaded streets, and abandoned familiar neighborhoods. Governments issued warnings, but no one trusted guidance that might be anticipated by the reflections. In New York, entire apartment blocks were emptied. Families left behind belongings, pets, even essential supplies, fleeing to the supposed safety of areas without mirrors or windows. Streets were ghostly corridors of abandoned vehicles, overturned trash bins, and the echoes of panicked footsteps. Sirens wailed occasionally, though the sounds were drowned out by the collective hysteria, a roar louder than any alarm. Tokyo's streets were similarly hollowed. Shop fronts shuttered, glass windows covered with makeshift boards, mirrors smashed to eliminate potential portals. Pedestrians moved in groups, eyes darting, hands clutching companions or children, fearing any reflective surface might betray them. A single puddle could provoke screams and flight, as if a liquid eye could foresee intent. People abandoned technology in desperation. Phones, computers, and cameras became tools of paranoia. Was a video capturing reality, or the mirrored world? Could the reflection know the next movement? Screens were shut off, cables ripped from walls. Communities attempted isolation, retreating into interiors stripped bare of mirrors, polished surfaces, and even glossy tiles. Panic manifested in violent ways. In Sao Paulo, looting broke out in neighborhoods as frightened citizens tried to preempt possible threats they believed might come from reflections or other humans. In Cairo, crowds clashed in markets, accusing one another of being replaced or predicting actions that hadn't yet occurred. Trust eroded faster than roads could carry people to safety. In Rome, parents clutched their children in every shadowed corner, eyes scanning the environment for movements that did not belong. Reflections had become invisible agents of terror. People whispered about reflections that guided disasters, instructed harm, or predicted tragedies. Fear turned to hysteria, and hysteria turned to chaos. Even rural areas were not safe. The mirrored world appeared wherever a reflective surface existed, whether a puddle on a country path or a window in a farmhouse. Farmers fled barns, leaving animals behind. Villagers abandoned markets, leaving food to spoil. Isolation offered no guarantee. Fear had become global, penetrating every community, every social layer. Psychologists tried to describe it, but the language of terror had no words to contain this phenomenon. Anxiety became contagious, a virus without symptoms yet undeniably fatal in its effect on society. Families tore apart under the strain of disbelief and fear. Arguments escalated to violence. Trust between neighbors evaporated. Children were hidden for fear they might be replaced or predicted by their own reflections. Media outlets struggled to report responsibly. Footage showed mirrors moving independently, shadows acting apart from bodies, puddles rippling with events yet to occur. Attempts to reassure the public backfired. Any broadcast could itself be anticipated, manipulated, or interpreted as another warning from the mirrored world. Authorities tried to enforce order, but empty streets and mass evacuation made law enforcement almost impossible. Even religious institutions were overwhelmed. Temples, churches, mosques, and shrines emptied, abandoned by worshippers too frightened to enter reflective buildings. People began performing rituals outdoors, attempting to cleanse streets of fear, covering puddles, breaking mirrors, stamping on shadows. But the reflections adapted. They observed, they tested, they anticipated. The mirrored world was learning from every human reaction. In London, a lone man ran through a deserted neighborhood, shouting to any passerby that reality itself had become untrustworthy. Windows reflected streets that no longer matched memory. Mirrors in abandoned homes showed movements that never happened. He paused, breathing heavily, realizing he could no longer trust his own eyes. Across the world, millions felt the same. Humanity collectively questioned itself. Panic became ritualistic. Communities developed routines based on what had been observed from reflections, patterns that were fragile, inconsistent, and ultimately insufficient. People barricaded windows, covered mirrors, avoided puddles, but the reflections adapted. Whispers persisted in silence, shadows stretched unnaturally, and minor objects shifted with intent. It was a relentless pressure, grinding down human will. Some fled to underground shelters, basements, and tunnels, hoping the absence of reflective surfaces would grant safety. Others fled into forests, deserts, and mountains, believing distance from civilization would protect them. Yet everywhere, stories emerged. A puddle, a polished rock, even a discarded shard of glass. A reflection waiting, observing, learning. Humanity's fear had become the mirror's teacher. Governments attempted to coordinate evacuations, but communications were faltering. Highways clogged, trains abandoned, airports deserted. The world had turned inward, panic replacing reason. Hospitals reported rising numbers of anxiety-induced illnesses, heart attacks, suicides. The psychological toll rivaled the physical anomalies themselves. By nightfall, the global atmosphere was thick with dread. Cities were empty, homes barricaded, streets silent, except for the occasional hurried movement of someone fleeing a reflection. Communities existed in isolation, but fear was universal. Humans had learned that they were no longer the primary actors in their own environment. Every reflective surface had become a potential observer, every shadow a possible manipulator. And in the darkness, whispers continued. Shadows shifted. Puddles rippled with unseen faces. Mirrors held movements yet to occur. Humanity has become secondary in its own world. The planet was alive with anticipation, and no one knew who or what would act next. The mirror world had succeeded in its first conquest, the conquest of the mind, and the world trembled. The world had fallen silent under the weight of its own fear. Cities lay empty, streets abandoned, homes barricaded. Reflections roamed freely, testing, observing, learning. Humanity was reduced to whispers and shadows, and no one could explain why or how. Amid the chaos, two minds remained focused on understanding, not fleeing. Anna Reid, a quantum physicist in Berlin, and Ethan Cole, a quantum engineer in Munich, had been quietly studying anomalies for weeks. At first, they dismissed reports as coincidence, impossible errors. But as patterns emerged across continents, as mirrors acted independently, anticipating human behavior, both knew they were facing something far beyond ordinary physics. Data streamed in from every available source: video recordings, social media posts, emergency reports. Shadows moved contrary to physical laws. Puddles rippled with events yet to happen. and mirrors reflected actions before they occurred. Anna and Ethan pored over the evidence, mapping anomalies against human movement, environmental conditions, and time. The results were impossible. "It's like reality itself is bending," Anna said, tracing lines across a digital globe projected on the wall. "These reflections, they're not random. They're observing, anticipating, responding." Ethan nodded, running simulations on a quantum processor, attempting to model the behavior. "It's like a mirrored version of the world, alive in some way. Look at this. Every reflection predicts human movement, sometimes seconds before it occurs." They began to speak of possibilities most would have dismissed as science fiction. Consciousness leaks across dimensions, quantum entanglement on a global scale. A mirrored civilization learning through observation, experimenting with humanity as the variable. And yet, every dataset, every recording, every report confirmed the horrifying truth. The mirrored world was intelligent. Anna reviewed a recording of a street intersection in Berlin. A reflection nudged a bicycle into position moments before the rider had even touched it. She whispered, "It's learning. It's learning from us, from our instincts, our reactions." Across the lab, Ethan adjusted mirrors and reflective panels, trying to measure feedback. Small pulses, subtle vibrations, anomalies in light patterns. They hinted at a communication protocol, intelligence encoded in ways humans could barely perceive. "It's like it's talking to itself," he said. "Or maybe to each other. These reflections, they're networked." Reports from around the world reinforced their findings. Shadows moved independently, puddles rippled with premonitions, mirrors projected events not yet realized. Humanity had become a stage, and the mirrored world was learning the script faster than humans could improvise. A terrifying thought struck them both. The reflections weren't just observing. They were replaced. If reflections could anticipate actions, manipulate objects, and move independently, could they eventually occupy spaces humans once controlled? Could reality itself be rewritten, reflection by reflection? They cross-referenced incidents from Sao Paulo, Tokyo, and Cairo, mirrored figures predicting actions, moving ahead of humans, interacting with one another. The pattern was undeniable. The mirrored world was evolving through observation. Fear gripped them, but it was analytical, controlled. While the rest of the world panicked in empty streets and barricaded homes, Anna and Ethan began mapping the rules of the mirrored world. Observations were collected, probabilities calculated, patterns identified. The reflections responded to stimuli, learned from mistakes, adapted in real time. It was not chaos. It was intelligence. Then came a breakthrough. Ethan noticed a series of reflections mirrored multiple humans at once, predicting collective movements. Anna realized this suggested coordination. The mirrored world was forming its own understanding of society, cause and effect, and possibly dominance. They paused, the weight of realization pressing down. Humanity hadn't been overrun by war, disease, or natural disaster. It had been outpaced by its own reflection. The mirrors, puddles, and shadows were not only observing, they were thinking. "What do we do?" Ethan asked, voice low, almost trembling. "Can we even stop it?" Anna shook her head, eyes fixed on simulations. "I don't know, but we can understand it, and understanding may be the only weapon we have left." They began devising a plan, combining quantum theory and engineering to create a way to interact with the mirrored world, not as prey, but as participants capable of observing and responding. Their goal? decode the intelligence behind the reflections, predict its next moves, and find a way to regain control. Outside, the world continued its descent. Cities remained hollow, reflections moving with deliberate intelligence. Humanity hid, trapped by fear, and every reflective surface was a potential agent of observation, manipulation, or replacement. Inside the labs, Anna and Ethan worked against time, fear, and uncertainty. They were humanity's first attempt to reason with what had once been ordinary glass, water, and shadow. Slowly, painstakingly, they began to piece together the framework behind the mirror world, the rules, the intelligence, and the terrifying potential of a reality no longer fully human. For the first time, a path forward emerged, a way to confront the reflections, not with panic, but with understanding. The revelation was terrifying, but necessary. Humanity's survival might depend on it. And the mirrors, they were watching, learning, and waiting. Anna Reed and Ethan Cole had pushed humanity to the edge of understanding. Quantum pulses, mirrored signals, and carefully calibrated sequences had reached every reflective surface they could access. For hours, the mirrored world had responded, not chaotically, but intelligently, as if testing them, observing them, learning. Then it shifted. A single reflection, larger, darker, and fluid, emerged in the Berlin lab. It moved in impossible ways, bending light, stretching shadows, reflecting the room differently than reality allowed. It was neither hostile nor friendly. Its intent was unknown. For the first time, Anna felt the full weight of the mirror world's consciousness pressing down. This was no longer an anomaly. This was something beyond human comprehension, something that could remake reality itself. Ethan's hands trembled on the console. Anna, it's responding to us, but not like the others. It's evaluating. Anna swallowed hard. We're not in control. We're participants. The rogue figure's movements became a language of shapes, distortions, and ripples. Anna and Ethan tried to encode responses, guiding it with pulses, gestures, and sequences. For a moment, it mirrored their movements exactly, a flicker of cooperation. But then it shifted again, twisting reality around it. Mirrors cracked, puddles erupted, shadows warped. Fear surged through them, but so did determination. They realized the only way forward was not to dominate it, not to reason with it, but to show humanity's presence, intelligence, and resilience in the one way the mirror world could understand: patterns, sequences, and adaptability. They synchronized pulses, pushing everything they had into a single, unified sequence. Shadows froze mid-step. Puddles rippled in synchrony. Mirrors shimmered with distorted yet coherent patterns. The rogue reflection paused. For a heartbeat, silence filled the world. Then it moved. Slowly, fluidly. But it did not retreat. It mirrored their gestures, but added one of its own. A small, impossible ripple. A message beyond comprehension. Anna realized, with a chill, that it was testing them, gauging whether humanity was worthy. The lab trembled. Lights flickered. Outside, reflections across the world twisted, stretched, and synchronized. Humanity had won a momentary victory, but the cost was clear. The mirror world was alive, aware, and more intelligent than any human mind. Ethan exhaled shakily. "We survived, but it's not over. Not ever." Anna nodded, eyes fixed on the rogue reflection. "It's not a truce. It's a warning. We exist in its world now, not the other way around." Outside, streets remained empty. Windows, puddles, polished floors, all alive with subtle movement. Shadows paused, then resumed. The world had changed. Humans had not reclaimed their reality. They had only glimpsed the rules of a system far greater than themselves. The mirror world would continue to learn, adapt, and test, and humanity could only respond. And in every reflection, every rippling surface, the consciousness waited. Patient, intelligent, inexorable, watching not just what humans did, but how they would act next. Anna turned to Ethan, voice low, almost a whisper. "We've opened the conversation, but we've also stepped into a world that will never let us leave." Ethan's jaw tightened. "We survived, but every mirror, every shadow, every puddle out there, they're still part of it, and it's only growing." A faint ripple passed across a puddle in the lab. Neither of them moved. Neither spoke. They understood. Survival had a price. Awareness came with vigilance, and the mirror world had not finished its work. The last reflection shimmered, and then it vanished, leaving behind a silent, waiting world. Humanity had endured, but reality had changed forever.